the standard view is that there are many living systems, say bacteria, that might agree are alive, but many of my colleagues would say have no conscious experiences. My own view is that that entire framework is wrong from the very, very start. The Big Bang is not the beginning of objective reality. Space and time itself is not fundamental reality. And the distinction that we make between living and non-living things is not principled. And also the distinction between conscious and unconscious things is not a principled distinction. It's an artifact of our interface.
Today, we are upsetting the very foundations of reality, because it turns out reality is a lot trickier to define than we thought. And we have the cognitive scientist, Dr. Donald Hoffman, on the show today. And we are going so deep into the nitty-gritties of how you can even prosecute theories of consciousness. It's been an off-limits topic, probably for good reason, and that's because it's such a difficult concept to pin down.
Our conversation with Donald Hoffman covers everything from the nature of reality to the source of awareness to what can be beyond space-time, if anything. We cover a tremendous amount of ground. He is clearly a thinker that has spent a lot of time pondering the implications of his own mathematical theorems and is uniquely able to bridge the gap between mathematical thinking and what would you even call it? Just normal phenomenology? It may be, yeah. So he bridges the gap between mathematics and phenomenology. And so you're able to have a conversation with somebody who recognizes the value of mathematical thinking for being able to have discussions within the scientific community, because scientists want to see theories well parameterized.
Yeah, he helped me understand a little bit better why academic scientists are so hung up on mathematics, and I think it's because it gives them a chalkboard to lay out their ideas in a way that they can trim them back in a procedural fashion.
And they can hand them to each other and be like, hey, this is my proof for this. Look at it. And then somebody else can look at this condensed thing and be like, well, you make mistakes here and here. Or they can look at it and they can be like, this is great. And as somebody who's not particularly mathematical,
And it's narrow too, right? Like a mathematical operation means one thing and only one thing. But oftentimes, even in science, we'll say things like, oh, when something's alive or blah, 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 blah. And it's like, what do they mean by that? What does alive mean? And like it almost never gets really hashed out. You can put some criteria down or whatever. And it's not just tricky words like life. It's all of the words that we use in language without being really rigorous like we are easily doing in mathematics, since it's such a limited set of quantitative interactions. We lack the ability to be precise enough to trim off ideas as they go in a systematic fashion. Folks, please come over and support us on Patreon. This allows us to keep this podcast going, and we'd really like to be able to release more than one of these a week, and we need some help to make that happen. So jump over to Patreon at DemystifySci and give us a boost. It really means the world to us.
Yes, it does. And as a patron, you get to come to our Sunday Hangouts where you get to talk to us about the world of science and what you see and what you want us to do. We're going to start releasing fresh episodes that the rest of the world does not get to see. And so you're going to get some extra content. And you get to support a project of the future of science. So there's a lot of things going for you.
Please help us steer the scientific revolution. It's got to happen.
The scientific revolution starts now.
The Sci Podcast.
Let us see in the dark.
So what have you been up to for the last... Okay, we spoke 2 weeks ago?
Yes. I've been working on this theory of consciousness some more, and actually writing a paper on it. We have a new model of how conscious agents can combine and fuse. So working on the mathematics of that, and actually spending most of my research time writing a paper now for publication on it. We're going to submit it to a journal called Entropy. It's pretty fun. It's To my surprise, the mathematics shows a form of combination of consciousnesses that I hadn't anticipated. And we've had the mathematics for 8 years, and I didn't notice it until about 6 weeks ago that the mathematics was saying something very, very unusual, that that agents can literally, you could have 2 agents or n different agents, and they can literally fuse down to a single agent with a single new conscious experience. So that was a bit of a surprise. So we're writing that up.
A lot of the work that you do is really mathematical in nature.
Yes.
What do you think that that's a necessary aspect of this kind of work? Is it just not possible to do without mathematics? Or is it, if you do it without mathematics, does it just become a different thing altogether?
Well, my attitude about it is that we have studied consciousness for thousands of years with meditation and various spiritual traditions and stories and so forth. And we've learned a lot about consciousness. And as a scientist, I, of course, am very interested in reading that and understanding all the insights that we've gotten. But my attitude as a scientist is that we've learned over and over again that if you take your intuitions and make them rigorous, you make them precise so that you can't wiggle out. In other words, you take your ideas and say, I'm going to state it exactly this way. No wiggle room, can't argue my way out of it. This is what I exactly said to mathematical precision. You get rewarded for that because then you find out what was wrong with your ideas. You find out the limitations, and then you say, okay, no, I didn't say that quite right, and I have this proof that I got it wrong. And so for me, the mathematics doesn't mean that we're going to get it right. It means 2 things. We're going to avoid dogmatism, which that's the difference between spirituality and religion, is dogmatism. And so to avoid a step into dogmatism and frankly, to avoid being stuck in the same ideas for too long, because we would like to find the limits of our current ideas and our current conceptions and move beyond. So for me, mathematics provides that kind of tool to be precise so that you're not dogmatic and so that you can communicate clearly what you're thinking, but also
So like would you say it enforces logic? It's like it's a sort of rule base that everybody can agree to, and it self-referees the logic that you're trying, because it seems like
right.
Philosophy in general is a lot about really prosecuting a logical argument. But it doesn't. The thing about math that worries me is that it doesn't police the assumptions that go into the statements in the first place.
Right.
How do you retain rigor with that?
Oh, I completely agree that every scientific theory, every mathematical theory starts with certain assumptions, and those are the unexplained miracles at the start of everything that you're doing. So absolutely. What's nice about the mathematical approach is that you are forced to state what your miracles are. So these are my miracles. I can't explain this. So instead of pretending that I have a theory of everything, I have to confess up front what I can't explain. And
it's getting very religious.
That's right. It's a true confession of the scientist that I can't explain this. And then the mathematics, then I agree, it enforces logic. So you can't say something and its negation at the same time, right? And try to wiggle out. So it forces you not to be self-contradictory. But I think the other thing that really is powerful about mathematical, so I completely agree with the limits. Absolutely. Mathematics is not the royal road that'll give us a theory of everything. We can never get a theory of everything. But mathematics will tell us, first, have we stated our ideas precisely and consistently, or have we contradicted ourselves? But second, once we have a mathematical theory, we become the students of the theory. So for example, Einstein had in his general theory of relativity, he had what he called the happiest thought of his life or happiest idea of his life around 1906, 1907, where he realized that if he was in a falling elevator, standing on a scale to weigh himself, when the elevator was in free fall, he would weigh 0. That was the non-mathematical intuition. It took Einstein, and this is not Hoffman, this is Einstein, a brilliant guy. many, many years to turn that idea into a mathematically precise equation with the foundation of general relativity. So he struggled and struggled to take that intuition, that casual idea, and turn it into precise mathematics. But he finally did it. And by the way, it was hard work. He had to learn all this new mathematics. Apparently, he had many sleepless nights worrying about this and struggling with it, but he finally got it. He published it. A year later, a guy named Schwarzschild, who I guess was fighting in World War I and had time to think about these equations anyway, wrote back to Einstein and said, I found a solution to your equations. And the solution is what we now call black holes. Well, Einstein had no idea that his theory of gravity entailed black holes, and he didn't like it. He was very much opposed to black holes. So that's where the theory comes back, and even if you're Einstein, the theory comes back and teaches you or slaps you in the face and says, wake up, here's what your idea is. When you talk about someone in a falling elevator weighing 0, it means that there's black holes. Well, who would ever have guessed that? Who would ever have guessed that that meant there was a leap from falling elevators to black holes?
Or they've exceeded the boundary conditions of the statements that they made inside of the elevator when they're making the equivalence between inertia and gravity.
And this is kind of related to what I was about to say, which is that when you have sufficiently complex mathematics, right? Because I'm saying this as an observer who sits from the outside, and my mathematical prowess is slim to none, right? Like geometry and basic calculus is where I live. And I'm like, what happens when somebody has sufficiently complex mathematics that it cannot be checked? Because you say, you know, like you go to CERN, and in order to evaluate the data, you have 100 pages of equations that eventually get simplified down to like a single term or like a single relationship. But when you have 100 pages of equations, how many people are there that can actually understand what's being said well enough to be able to proofread it and to be able to say that, like, hey, perhaps the black hole is an anomaly because it's outside of our model space and it's no longer bearing on reality, versus, no, this is definitely bearing on reality and it's the correct interpretation of what we see, which we'll get to what reality is in a minute, because I know that that's...
Well, no, you raise a very important point, and that is that with the mathematics, it requires a tremendous amount of concentration and human fallibility is involved here now, where you look at the mathematics, try to understand what it's saying. And that's why what we do in science is we have checks and double checks, right? Someone puts out their mathematical, what they think is their proof, and then dozens of other mathematicians, people who are qualified to look at it, all look at it as well and try to poke holes. And it's only if so that's what the peer review process is designed to do, is address exactly the question that you're raising, that someone claims that they have a proof for some big mathematical thing, and the first reaction is very interesting, but skepticism. Let's see if a lot of other people agree. And, you know, if 20 people go through the math and agree, doesn't mean that you're right, but it means that the chance that you're wrong is starting to get not worth worrying about.
What do you make, though, about, we talked about assumptions really briefly and how important that is, but what about boundary conditions? Like, are you aware of like the ultraviolet catastrophe? Sure. Right, where you often encounter this, and I encountered it in my own work in the academy, where you can fit a curve, let's say, to some phenomena, some data set that you have that represents some phenomenon. And the curve might lead you into some extreme condition, but you realize that at some point through experimentation that extreme condition is impossible. Maybe it's even impossible from the start, like in the case of the ultraviolet catastrophe.
Which is?
Just the idea that the energy should scale extremely high. Like there's more energy necessary than possible than is observed in the light that comes out. And so what do you make of the idea that we can have these blind spots where we think a theory is telling us one thing and we don't necessarily have the tools to be able to test that? And so we end up with these really extreme extrapolations that you know can lead us into the weeds.
Well, that's a wonderful example of what I think is the power of the mathematics here. So the ultraviolet catastrophe is a property of black body radiation. So when you heat up an object, it starts to glow. And as you change the temperature of it, as you increase the temperature, the color changes and the energy that's being emitted changes. And so Newton's theory of physics made predictions about the amount of energy that should happen as you heat the thing up. And it turns out that it goes to infinity. So ultraviolet means as you go to higher and higher frequencies, the energy that Newton predicted goes to infinity. But that flatly contradicted the empirical results that we were getting in the lab. So that was called the ultraviolet catastrophe. And there were two attitudes about it. One was, well, we just have to, tinker with Newton a little bit and so forth. We'll figure it out. And they tried that for quite a while. And then in 1900, a guy named Max Planck, in desperation, made a little wrinkle on Newton. He said energy comes in little units, we now call them quanta. And he found that if he did that, then the math predicted exactly the right profile of energies. So we had to take Newton and make a new assumption, a mathematical assumption, that there are these quanta of energy, that they come in packets, not continuous. And that was the birth. It took 26 years from Max Planck's initial discovery to a full quantum theory, 25 or 26 years. But that was, again, a good example of why we do these things with mathematical precision. It's one thing to have Newton's ideas and, force and mass and acceleration are roughly related, versus F equals ma, right? So you have down this equation and you write things down with mathematical precision. Then you get these, like the ultraviolet catastrophe, is where the theory is crying uncle. It says, I'm getting the wrong answer. That's what you want, is for your theory to tell you, I can't do this anymore. And then
it's interesting nobody interpreted it as, oh, well, obviously there's just this point of infinite energy that occurs,
Well, they couldn't see it.
Right. Okay.
And I think that's kind of the place where we go to, which is that but
isn't a black hole something you can't see?
Well, I mean, it's tricky now because there's images, right, that are of black holes, right. And you can argue about what it is that they're imaging and how they're filtering those pictures and like the data collection. But
an image of a hole is also just not a non-image in a sense as well.
Yes, so I guess that's something that is perplexing to me, which is that it does seem like there are these fundamental assumptions in much of the mathematical physics and mathematical philosophy where sometimes there is an assumption that is an interpretation that is so beyond belief that it is hard to square with the way that you see reality. But I think that this comes down to what your theory says, which is the fact that the way that you see reality is a representation of what is actually underneath and is not a reflection of truth.
That's right. And once again, that's such a strange idea, right? So that you need to have, so the idea that I look at the moon, you look at the moon, and we both say, yeah, I see the moon. And then I say, you know what? We're both not really seeing the truth. We're seeing just a user interface description of something that's not in space and time and is nothing like the moon. Now that's, you should be locked up for statements like that. That's really crazy. Right? and so the only reason that I even go there is because our best scientific theories, with all their mathematical precision, namely evolution by natural selection and quantum field theory with gravity, both of those theories entail the probability that space-time is fundamental and therefore objects in space-time is fundamental is zero. So it's when our math forces us against our wills, kicking and screaming, to recognize that space and time are not fundamental. And that
what do you mean fundamental, by the way? What is this?
Well, so
what is this idea?
Most scientists, and most of my colleagues even today, but and most physicists, except for I think the new generation of physicists doesn't think this way anymore, but have taken space and time as the fundamental nature of reality. If you say, what is the bottom line? How deep can you go and no further? It's space and time, and then the elementary particles in space and time. So
it's like everything is built upon something that is fundamental. Like it is the basis upon which all else flows. Is it something like that?
I see it as a deep-seated materialism that basically says that everything can be described in 3 dimensions of length, height, and width plus time. And so basically
Everything, like material things or ideas or...
Well, I think that consciousness has also been, people have been trying to explain consciousness and ideas as emergent from the physical relationships between objects, right? Because if you're trying to explain a brain state by saying that this collection of neurons fires and that's what causes you to experience the pain of a breakup, then what you're
But what
doing
causes the neurons to fire? And
it,
then so on
again,
and so on?
it's you keep going upstream. It's ion channels and it's deformation of like the heart muscles as it pumps in like a weird way. It's like it comes always back to materialism, and I think that what Dr. Hoffman is suggesting is that the materialist vision of reality is insufficient.
I think that you're right that almost all of my colleagues studying consciousness take space and time and particles in space and time as fundamental, and you see that in their theories, as you were saying. So some of them are just flat out physicalists. They're looking at how certain kinds of brain activity are identical to or give rise to conscious experiences. But the idea is that the brain activity really does exist. Brains exist in space and time, and that's objective reality. And starting with that objective reality, we can then boot up consciousness. So consciousness is a latecomer in the universe, right? After the Big Bang, there 13.8 billion years ago, there was no consciousness. There was just heat and particles and so forth. And it took a long time for them to coalesce to the point where we might get life, and then much longer after life emerged to get consciousness. And so from that story, consciousness itself is nothing but some kind of product of complicated interactions of matter. And so even those who are panpsychists, my colleagues who are panpsychists in various stripes, so Philip Goff, for example, and these are, by the way, when I disagree with their theories, these are friends, intelligent colleagues, and so it's all in good spirit of collegial. We're trying to be good scientists and
it wouldn't really be
ideas.
Science if people didn't disagree. Like
exactly.
I think that
how are we going to move forward otherwise?
Yeah.
That's right. So it's we disagree and then go have a beer, that kind of thing. So Philip Goff, for example, he's a panpsychist, so he's taking consciousness very, very seriously. He's taking it as fundamental, but he wants to stick it inside the current laws of physics. So he says that essentially mental properties and conscious properties are one and the same. They're not distinct. So he's identifying mental properties or conscious properties with current physical models of particles in space and time. And
what's the problem with mapping? What do you think? Yeah, sorry, you're probably about to say that, but what's the problem with mapping mental processes onto conscious processes?
Oh, well, when I think Goff was talking about mental processes, he was using it as a broad term that includes consciousness and perhaps unconscious mental processes.
Can we define these terms? So, like, when you say consciousness,
oh yeah, sure.
I've heard you describe it as it's the experience of seeing the blue of the sky, and it's this internal experience. Is that the limits of it, or does it require also then to be able to look around and be like, well, what does it mean that the sky is blue? Does that guy see blue as the same as me? Is that necessarily a part of consciousness, or is it just the sensation of the blue?
Well, for me, consciousness involves, of course, the specific experiences that we have: a headache, nausea, the sound of a trumpet, the color blue, the taste of a strawberry. So all these specific conscious experiences that we have. But it also involves the notion of a subject who is actually experiencing. So there's the experience, but then there's some notion of an experiencer that we need to have. One might argue that there's no such thing as an experiencer. There are only occasions of experience. That would be a different approach to say. So that would be there is no subject. There's only the experience and occasion. And you could try to build a model that way. And then it seems to me that there's also awareness without content. That another aspect of consciousness is just to be aware of being aware, but not aware of any specific thing within awareness. So it's awareness of being aware without awareness of any particular color or headache or smell or whatever it might be. And these are all the kinds of informal concepts that one would want to have at play in a scientific theory of consciousness. One might dispute any of them. You might say, your notion of a subject makes no sense to me. I think we just want occasions of experience, period. The notion of awareness without content makes no sense to me. But I'm trying to lay out on the table all the things that are typically viewed as fair game for theories that are trying to deal with consciousness. And for what it's worth, I think that all the things I mentioned really do need to be taken seriously and given a mathematical description in a theory of consciousness, or given a mathematical theory that doesn't have those parts, but shows why it works to handle everything that we know about consciousness anyway.
Is all of life conscious?
Well, I can tell you what most of my colleagues would say first, and then I'll tell you my view. I would say that the 99.99% of my brilliant and good friend colleagues would endorse the view that life is a relative newcomer in the universe, that there was millions, perhaps billions of years in which there was no life in the universe, and that after life emerged, then probably it was a lot longer before consciousness emerged. And so I would think the standard view is that there are many living systems, say bacteria, that might agree are alive, but many of my colleagues would say have no conscious experiences. My own view is that that entire framework is wrong from the very, very start. The Big Bang is not the beginning of objective reality. Space and time itself is not fundamental reality. And the distinction that we make between living and non-living things is not principled. And that's a strong claim. I'm saying that the distinction is not a principled distinction. And also the distinction between conscious and unconscious things is not a principled distinction. It's an artifact of our interface. And we've mistaken a limit of our perceptual interface for an insight into the nature of reality.
Yeah, what does principled mean? It means that we haven't delineated it in a fundamental fashion, like it can't be consistently applied, or
yeah, I'm saying that distinction that we make is very much like the distinction right now. For example, we're talking via Zoom, and I'm not seeing you directly, right? I've got a desktop with tens of thousands of pixels on it. Some of those pixels are for your desk. Some of the pixels are for your shirt, and those I would say those aren't living pixels, right? They're not. But there's some pixels which are about your face. Well, should I say that the pixels for your face are alive, and the pixels that represent your desk are dead? Or should I just note that distinction is nothing to do with pixels? Pixels are pixels, and sometimes the pixels give me more insight into who you are, your consciousness, and sometimes the pixels don't. And so when you view space and time and everything that you perceive around you as a user interface, then a user interface, by definition, is dumbing things down, it's simplifying things. And so sometimes I get insight into consciousness and life, and other times I don't. That doesn't mean anything deep. It just means that here, my interface, when it's showing me something I call a rock, I have no insight into life or consciousness. Does that entail that there's no life or consciousness? No, it just means my interface gave up. So
But
that's
there's
why I
something
think it's
really
not
interesting here.
Yeah.
Yeah. There's something really interesting here, though, because I'm thinking about this example of looking at the representation on the screen and how it maps or it doesn't map an underlying reality. And this is another thing that I wanted you to define before we really start to get into the meat of the theory. But the way that I interpret it is that so space and time you're saying that they're not fundamental because there's something underneath that if I visualize it intuitively, it's I think maybe you said this or somebody else, it's like a rock in a river, and it creates a stable form on the surface of the water as the water flows over it, but it's not the water that has that form, it's the rock that's giving it the form. And so there's something underneath what we call space and time, which is physical, like 3 dimensions of length, height, and width, as in relation to positions, right? Like, to put it in rational language. Objects have positions. Those positions change over time. And what this theory suggests is that there's something behind position and movement relative to one another, such as the rock in the river. But what I see is that the representation on the Zoom screen is still telling me something about the thing that I'm seeing based off of my understanding of what is alive and what isn't alive. Because you're like, should I delineate between the dead pixels and the live pixels? And I'm like, not necessarily, but some of the pixels are representing something that is alive, right? Like if you were to poke me in the face, like right where those pixels were, I'd be like, ah, right?
Well, also we have the ability to step back and realize the pixels don't have their own intentions and so on and so forth, right? I mean, it depends how we define life. Like I don't know if you have a definition for life, but often we say that life is something that moves with intention physically. And so it's tricky to imagine how to draw the line otherwise. Do you try to define life in any way, or?
I think that those who've tried to give a pithy definition have come up with something like it's an entity that can resist the second law of thermodynamics and reproduce itself. So it sort of seems to go against it has mechanisms for fighting the growth of entropy, and it can reproduce itself. So that's how, when you boil life down to its essence in the standard way of looking at things, they would try to get the essence of life. But the reason that I think that space and time are not fundamental is because the two pillars of modern science, namely evolution by natural selection and quantum field theory with gravity, both unequivocally tell us that space-time is not fundamental. That's why I believe it's not fundamental, is because our theories of space-time tell us that the thing that they're giving us a theory about could not possibly be fundamental. So,
can you elaborate on that?
I think you just mean because you can't possibly rectify those two frameworks together without invoking some other more fundamental structure, like gravity and quantum mechanics?
Well, it's even deeper than that. It's when you put them together, they tell you that space-time itself has no operational meaning beyond the Planck scale, which is 10 to the minus 33 centimeters and 10 to the minus 43 seconds. It ceases to have any operational meaning whatsoever. So space-time itself, the reductionist hope was that as we go to smaller and smaller scales of space-time, we get to more and more fundamental objects and more fundamental laws. And that's been the physicalist reductionist hope. And we've had some success, right? We can reduce temperature to, the dynamics of particles that we can't see, the statistical dynamics of particles. But what our theories now tell us is that there is no meaning to space and time below the Planck scale. And so that's quantum field theory and gravity together. But then independently, evolution by natural selection agrees. It says the probability is zero that our perceptions, any of our perceptions, are telling us the truth. It's saying the probability is zero. That means space and time and physical objects are there. What evolution says, these are there to guide adaptive behavior, period. They're not there to show you the truth. And in fact, if you ask what is the probability that anything that you see that is in fact guiding your behavior adaptively, what's the probability that what you're seeing is the truth? It's precisely zero. So,
but doesn't that place truth at the Planck scale?
I'm sorry?
So that seems to imply that truth is located at the Planck scale.
Most physicists would not say that. One interpretation would be to say, look, so what we have then is pixels of reality at the Planck scale. Those are the fundamental pixels of reality. And the physicists are very, very, so Nima Arkhani-Hamed and others are very, very quick to say, no. If you do that, you, for example, contradict Lorentz invariance and so forth. So it just doesn't make sense to talk about pixels at the Planck scale. But what they're doing is they're saying what we need is a completely new, out of the box, something brand new that is unlike space and time, just completely unlike it. And we have to get this new, deeper structure and then show how space and time are projections, simple energy or information losing projections of this much deeper structure, and they're finding
This
these
is
things.
very much like the allegory of the cave.
Very much so, and in fact, the user interface metaphor that I've been using, I think, is very similar in spirit to Plato's allegory of the cave. I think Plato, if he had the user interface, he probably would have thought it was a better metaphor than the cave. He used what he had, right? Because
I like that.
shadows. The problem with the metaphor that Plato was stuck with is that the shadows roughly resemble the objects, right? If I'm dancing in front of the fire and you see my shadow, you know that it's not an elephant. You know it's more like a human shadow, and so you get some hint. But the user interface is that they could be utterly unrelated in format completely.
So before we get into the Nima Arkhani-Hamed and the sort of the space-time is doomed stuff, I want to take a step back, and I really want to deal with what you say about the convergence of the conclusions of quantum mechanics and evolution, both leading you to say that space-time is doomed. So from what I understand, your experiments on the ability to perceive reality are theoretical in nature, right? You basically you play these evolutionary games where you model what entity survives, the entity that can perceive truth or the entity that perceives some artifice. And the ones that perceive the artifice are the ones that win, the ones that perceive the truth are the ones that lose. And so you say that the theory of evolution says that the ones that can actually perceive reality are the ones that die out. And so we've been selected for to not understand reality. Is that a...
Well, so that's what we started off first doing. So in like 2007, 2008, I began to suspect that there was something interesting here with evolutionary theory. And so I worked with some graduate students, and we didn't have a mathematical theory or proof of it, but we started running these genetic algorithms, which were like what you just described. And what we found was in our genetic algorithms, the organisms, the artificial organisms that we created in our simulations that we let see the truth, were not more fit than the ones that didn't see the truth. In fact, they wasted time seeing the truth. It took extra time and energy to see the truth. So that then led me to go to a mathematician and say, let's use the tools of evolutionary game theory. The simulations suggest there's something here. It suggests there's something very interesting here. Let's go after it. And so it's not the simulations that are the proof. It was the mathematics. And one of the key ideas that sort of cinched it for me is realizing there are these things called fitness payoff functions that are sort of the heart of the mathematical formulation of evolutionary theory. They are the heart and soul of the evolutionary game theory. And so these fitness payoff functions are like the points that you can get in a video game when you're trying to play a game as fast as you can, trying to get as many points as you can, and not die, so that you can get to the next level. Well, so in evolution, it's sort of like it's like a game, and you're trying to get these points. And if you get enough points, you don't go to the next level, but your genes go to the next level in your offspring. Now, here's the interesting thing: when we look at those payoff functions depend on the state of objective reality, whatever that reality might be. Okay, so whatever the reality is, the payoff functions depend on that, but they also depend on the organism, like a lion versus Hoffman, the state, hungry versus sated, and the action, feeding, fighting, fleeing, and mating. So the payoff functions are complicated functions, but in their domain is the objective reality. And then the range there is the points. So it might be from 0 to 100. 0 means you're dead. 100 means you got as many points as you could. You're probably going to have kids. So here's the technical question. If our senses are going to be shaped by evolution to see the truth, then there better be information about the truth in the payoff functions. If the payoff functions contain no information about the structure of whatever reality is, then it's not possible for the payoff functions to shape the sensory systems to know that structure. So we did a very, very simple question then. Although, it's very simple, but I had a mathematician work on it. So when you have a mathematician, So Chaitan is a brilliant mathematician. Manish,
There's an asterisk on that.
yeah, that's right. So they did very, very hard work, and I'm very grateful to them. But what you can do is you can say, let's count the total number of payoff functions. So you start off with the world. You say, suppose the world has only m states. So m is some finite number. And then the payoff values are only n, so like 1 to 100. And you can say, okay, if that's the case, how many payoff functions would preserve and you can pick your structure in the world. Suppose it had a topology. Suppose it had a total order. Suppose it had a whatever structure you want. You say, so first, how many payoff functions are there? And that's easy, that's trivial. Even for me, it's trivial. So that's trivial. Then you can say how many preserve, what we call homomorphism of a particular structure. And so you put the number that preserve the structure on the numerator and the total number in the denominator. And then you look at the limit. As the number of states in the world goes to infinity and the number of payoff values increases, what is the probability that the payoff, randomly chosen payoff function would have any information about the structure in the world? And the answer is 0. Over and over again, the answer is 0. There's only one exception we can go into if you're interested. But basically, the idea, we've done it for 3 or 4, but I know it's going to be true in general because you have to satisfy some pretty rigorous equations to be a homomorphism. As soon as you satisfy those equations, you're essentially measure 0. So that's why the evolution can't shape us to see the truth, because the very thing that's shaping you, the payoff functions, almost surely does not know the truth. So if you're being shaped by something that doesn't know the truth, you're not going to be shaped to see the truth. We can go into more detail.
Is it possible that that it's because there's payoff functions that are counterproductive, that are shielding the theory from really revealing what's happening? Like, I think about right now in society, there's decreasing fertility. At least people in our country are having less babies than in the past, maybe around the world. And is that because there's a new payoff function emerging, which is something like having babies isn't worth it because I got other stuff to do? And so there's new sorts of there's something else other than just this reproduction-driven selection going on. And maybe there has been for all of human history, and we've failed to account for that. And if humans are what we're calling the epitome of consciousness, then we could be missing something really big.
Epitome of consciousness?
It seemed like it under the model because bacteria aren't. So I'm like,
yeah, no,
well, if bacteria aren't, then
well. So I'll just talk now just in terms of evolutionary theory and what it says, not in terms of my bigger idea here. So this is now just putting on being an evolutionary theorist hat. The way that your question is typically addressed is that there are different strategies for successfully having and raising kids, and you see this all through nature. So some spiders will have hundreds or thousands of babies, and they just have them and say goodbye and let you know. And most of them don't make it.
We have this is an aside, we have an earwig infestation right now, and apparently everybody on the West Coast does. But Shiloh was reading about earwigs, and he discovered that, I think that it's K-selection when you have lots of babies, but you don't take care of them. He discovered that earwigs have lots of babies, but they do take care of them.
they're very caring pests. That's the truth.
Well, and so, but that's an interesting thing, right? Because it shows there's different strategies. So you could have just one kid. So you might be very wealthy, and but to be wealthy, you've got to work really hard. And so you decide I'm going to have one kid, but I'm going to really do everything I can for that one kid, and make a high probability that kid gets passed on to the next generation. Or there are some human beings that where I'm not recommending this, but there are some guys that just go and knock up a lot of women and say goodbye. And that works. Yep.
It worked for Genghis Khan.
Sorry?
I said it worked for Genghis Khan.
But what's even more interesting to me is there's also a lot of guys like Newton. Let's just say Newton. We already brought him up. But there's lots of guys also who just contribute to something else, which is...
I believe it's called the meme pool.
Yeah, it's a meta phenomenon to some extent, right? I mean, it's not exactly this survival of his lineage, but perhaps it's leading to survival of the greater conscious entity. I saw something in one of your works too, where you were talking about these different scales of consciousness too, which is really, we can get into that later. But
we're a little bit in the weeds.
Sorry about
That's totally like. Is there a solid question in here that leads us back to the idea of why it is that the theory of evolution shows that true perception of reality is not like.
I guess it makes perfect sense to me that the theory of evolution is incomplete.
Okay, so what you're saying is that the theory of evolution is missing something, and so what is happening is that we actually are seeing perceptions that are real, and our model of evolution can't like incorporate that somehow.
That's the way I always thought about it, but I think this is a bit different.
The way that I see it a little bit is that you say that there's no veridical perception, but I'm like, look, the veridical perception, like if you have a relationship where the situation is that you're facing a lion and the lion will or will not eat you, does it matter if you can't see what's at the Planck scale? Like the lion will eat you not at the Planck scale. It will eat you at the like life and limb scale.
Very good. So a couple of very, very important points. First, the reason why I say that we don't see reality as it is because that's just what's entailed by our current theory of evolution by natural selection. That's just a theorem of that theory. So I'm not saying that that theory is true, but I'm just saying that we don't right now have a better theory. There is no competitor that is anywhere close to the scope of explanatory power of evolution by natural selection. There's nothing that's even close. So as a scientist, it's my responsibility to study the only thing that really is on the table right now, and that theory clearly says we don't see reality as it is. Now, one attitude just to say, as Charlotte was saying, okay, well that means the theory is incomplete, and we need a deeper theory, and that's perfectly fine. And so that's one way to go, and maybe the deeper theory will show that we do see reality as it is. But of course, to propose that is not to have done it. We would have to do that. We would have to show a deeper theory that's compatible with all the evidence we have from evolution, the empirical evidence, and that shows exactly where current evolutionary theory got it wrong, and then shows that with that theory we see the truth. So you would have to do that. So
I just clarify real quick, you don't mean just that we see some bandwidth limited version of reality, right? Like obviously I can't see all the electromagnetic radiation in this room. You mean something completely different, that actually there's no one-to-one correspondence between even the electromagnetic radiation that I see and the objective reality that underpins that phenomenon.
That's right. So I can put it this way. According to evolution by natural selection, the very language of shapes and colors and objects and motions in space and time is the wrong language to describe objective reality. So it's not that we're getting this shape a little bit off or that color a little bit wrong. It's that no true description of objective reality is possible given that language. It's the wrong language.
Even though it's so functional for us on the day-to-day.
Exactly right. So, and it's functional in the same. So here's why I use the user interface example. So on your user interface, I have a blue icon for a book I'm writing, say. So then the blue icon is on my desktop, and it's blue and rectangular in the lower right corner of my desktop. But is the book itself blue and rectangular in the lower right corner of the computer? Well, no. Those are in fact the wrong predicates to use for a book. Books don't have color. The book in my computer, right, the thing in my computer that I'm actually interacting with when I write the book has no color. It doesn't have a shape. It's not rectangular. So everything about its representation on the desktop is only there to allow me to interact with the file, which is these voltages and magnetic fields inside the computer in this metaphor that I'm using. So there are all these, there are literally hundreds of millions of voltages and magnetic fields in there. It's a mess. It's complicated. And I just see this simple, dumbed down blue rectangular icon, and I can click on it, and I can type on a few keys on the keyboard. What I'm doing is toggling millions and millions of voltages. So in that metaphor, that's the reality. Millions of voltages, and I'm toggling them in precise ways. All the toggling has to be precisely right, or it doesn't work. Now, I couldn't do that if I had to toggle the voltages one by one. But with the user interface, I can double-click on an icon, or I can type on keys on the keyboard and control all those voltages. And that's the evolutionary story I'm telling you. That evolution wants to keep us alive. So just from an evolutionary point of view, the goal is to keep you alive long enough to reproduce. And the question is the best way to do that to let you see the truth? No. The best way to do that is to give you a user interface that lets you control the truth, but doesn't force you to know all the voltages in reality that you're toggling. If you had to toggle all those voltages, you would die.
But what makes those any more true than the contextualized truth that you're working on a book in your house on a computer?
Yeah, like it seems that from where I'm sitting, like there's multiple levels of truth that we're talking about.
Like it is true that you're using a user interface and it helps you organize your thoughts using, typing and
I like the
words.
vision of you as like a wizard who's just like, each key press is just this fantastical network of things happening inside the computer. It's very poetic.
Well, I agree with you guys completely. All I'm using evolutionary theory to do is to say space and time and the objects in it that you're seeing and the colors and so forth, according to this theory, that's not the truth. You have to go deeper. And
they're not the
but
fundamental
that doesn't mean that
truth.
my next theory is going to be the final theory, right? So I propose a theory of conscious agents. I will be the first to say, I would bet against me. In fact, I would bet against any scientific theory being the final theory of everything. I think, in principle, there is no such thing as a scientific theory of everything, in principle. And I think we can prove it. I think Gödel, with his incompleteness theorem in 1930, essentially proved that there is no scientific theory of everything. Now, that doesn't mean as a scientist that I just throw up my hands and give up. What it means is and it doesn't mean that it's a quixotic venture to just be looking for new scientific theories. I think it's really interesting to have this double view in which you realize no scientific theory can ever be the final theory of everything. And yet it's worth our effort to go to the next level and find out what's wrong with our current theories and go a step deeper, even though we know that will never get to a final theory of everything. And understanding why that's the case, I think, is one of the deepest things for us to truly try to wrap our heads around, is that no cognitive or mathematical specific theory can ever be the final word. We just have to recognize that. And yet, we do use words. We do have perceptions that can't be the final truth. And somehow, whatever consciousness is, it transcends any particular description. It transcends any particular way of viewing it. And yet it spends its time immersed in various ways. And so there's something very, very deep going on here that I can tell you what I think at top level might be going on here. And that is, again, it comes from Gödel's incompleteness theorem. Gödel showed that there's no end to the exploration of mathematical structure, period. No end. There's no way to be omniscient about it. If you have any axiomatization, set of axioms and derivation rules that you can prove all these theorems, Gödel says, if your system is sophisticated enough to, for example, be able to do arithmetic, then I will be able to show you a statement that's true. It's a true statement, true in your system, but cannot be proven within your system. And that means that your theory doesn't get all truths. Your mathematical and scientific theories are mathematical, so that applies to scientific theory. That means
this is what you were saying about the magic assumptions at the beginning. Is that what you were saying about the magic assumptions at the beginning?
Well, so those are two different ways to come at the same idea. Those.
And I would throw in boundary condition and context as well, because it seems like I've heard it said before that if you try to talk about everything, you end up talking about nothing. And so this reminds me of the Gödel work as well, where we really need to bound our statements in some context. This is the context of, it is true that Dr. Hoffman's working on a book on his computer. And it is also true that there are atoms doing insane motions inside of the computer that are providing for it. And these are two very different contexts, which require different boundary conditions if you're going to make statements about them.
That's right, and I think what Gödel is saying is that there's no end to the context that you could imagine, and that you could explore. And in the assumption, now this is a separate assumption now that I'm making, but it's a separate assumption. If we assume that consciousness is fundamental and it's all there is, so if we start with that assumption, then the only thing that mathematics could be about is the possible varieties of consciousness, conscious experiences and conscious structures. In that case, a natural question comes up. If consciousness is all there is, what is consciousness doing and why? What is it up to? And one answer, I don't know the answer. I mean, I'll say right up front, I don't know the answer. But here's one possible answer that is worth exploring. It's the only one that I've found that's deep enough to be worth exploring right now, is that based on Gödel's incompleteness theorem, consciousness is exploring its own possibilities. And Gödel's incompleteness theorem tells us that there is no end to the exploration. So what consciousness does, and so maybe the way, and this is now at the edge of my understanding, but maybe what consciousness is doing is it's saying, okay, let me take this kind of axiomatization, this kind of structure. Let me create a virtual world with that structure. Let me plunge myself into that world and explore it. And let me lose myself in that world. And think of myself some small little entity inside that world and really explore it and feel vulnerable. And let me then wake up to the fact that no, that was just a little infinitesimal aspect of what I am. But by exploring it fully and immersing myself and then waking up, I know what I am by knowing I'm not just that. And so that maybe, again, I'm not saying this is right, but it's the only idea that I've found that's deep enough to be worth pursuing so far.
I mean, I love it also because it fills in that gap in evolutionary theory, which provides for the behavior of life forms that isn't necessarily rooted in reproduction.
Right. Well, yeah. So, why do we do art, for example, and play music? Now, of course, I can give an evolutionary psychology story, right? So, I play. Guys are motivated to play good music because it makes them attractive to women, right? So you can tell that kind of story. Why do we want to be intellectuals? Because I can show off my intellectual prowess, and people are impressed, and so social status, and so forth.
But at the same time, like, you know very well that having an intellectual breakthrough or playing music is euphoric in and of itself as well. That, like, before you even have the perception that, oh, people are watching me or here's this thing, you also have this very true blissful experience on occasion anyways in each one of those, which
I agree.
The intuitions sort of violate the idea that it's motivated by something.
Well, I think that will doesn't figure prominently in the theory of evolution. Like, it's will only to reproduce, but it's not will towards anything else. And it's weird to me to assume that there isn't something that is bigger than just passing on direct physical copies of yourself.
Right. So this is an important point because we've been talking about these different scientific frameworks, right? And you can always have one framework, then you have to go beyond it and get a deeper framework. One critical thing about this is we go to deeper frameworks. We don't just throw away our earlier frameworks, right? When we go to Einstein and quantum field theory, we don't throw away Newton. We try to understand Newton as some kind of fitting into the bigger picture, maybe as a special case. And so I as I say, no scientific theory is the final word. The theory of evolution by natural selection, I'm using that right now because it's the deepest theory we have in this area. We don't have anything better. But I'm looking for a theory that's deeper, a theory of consciousness, in which the very notion of competition for limited resources may not be true. In other words, the very heart and soul of evolutionary theory may not be true of a deeper theory. And what we, as a scientist, what I have to do is say, okay, what is this deeper theory? And what is the projection of that deeper theory that gives me evolution by natural selection, that makes it look like there are limited resources and competition and fighting, and it's all about functional stuff, trying to get children to the next generation. That may be not a deep truth. It's only true in the headset. true.
It's
in
like
the
a
game.
lower order projection, like
Projection.
what you were saying about the
That's right.
amplitude and
But what we have to do is to take our current theories very seriously. So I mean, so I took evolution seriously, not because I think it's the final word, but because we have no better tool right now. There is nothing else on the table for life. We have informal ideas, but when I ask what is the best scientific tool we have right now, there is just nothing that competes with evolutionary theory. Even though I'll state right up front, I think that it's not the final word. I think that it's deeply wrong. Even its fundamental assumptions that it's all about reproduction are going to be shown at a deeper level to not be true, but artifacts of a projection. So this is important to see how the scientific. It's not that we say, oh, evolution, oh, garbage. No, 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 no. It's a precious gift. The theory of evolution is a precious gift because it is precise enough to tell us its limitations. It invites us to go beyond space and time and come up with a deeper theory, but it warns us that whatever deeper theory you come up with, you better be able to project down and get evolution with natural selection, or you're wrong. And that's the
it's
key
cool
point.
because you could make the argument that if your motivation, if life is true or consciousness is seeking exploration of itself, that survival would be inherently baked into the ability to continue to explore oneself, and so you could kind of fold it into the future theory in a way.
Well, I can say one direction that I'm looking to try to actually do exactly that kind of thing. So time, right? The limited resource, the fundamental limited resource that we have is time, right? We're running out of time. We have to hurry. You have to have your kids quick. You have to raise your kids quick. You have to get food quick. Everything, the fundamental limited resource is time. But what if we have the theory of consciousness? It's a dynamical theory. It's mathematically precise, but there's no entropic time. So it's a dynamics, but the entropy of the dynamics does not increase. So I can write. It turns out I can write my team and I can write down dynamical systems of conscious agents where it's easy to do where there is no increasing entropy. There is entropy, but it's not increasing. So there's no arrow of time. But it's a theorem, a 3-line proof that when you project that dynamics of consciousness any way that you project it using conditional probability, when you say you're getting a new view of that dynamics, the view of the dynamics has an arrow of time. That's the theorem. So the time arrow is an artifact.
As defined by the arrow of entropy, right? You mean time as the arrow of
exactly
entropy.
Right.
But that's kind of weird because aren't life forms not proceeding entropically in the first place? I mean, we're very organized creatures and we still experience time.
Right. So in fact, now looking from within the view of space and time and evolutionary theory. So now I'm just going to adopt that framework for the moment. In that view, what seems to be special about living creatures is that they fight the entropy, right? They don't just go, gentle into that dark night. They rage against the dying of the light, right? They're fighting the second law of thermodynamics. Their bodies are constantly taking in new energy sources and so forth. And so that's the picture from within. But there could be a deeper framework, say of consciousness, where there is no entropy increasing. There is no competition. There is no limit of resources. But when you and so there's some dynamics going on there, but when you project it, then it's a theorem that you will have at least one limited resource, namely time. And probably all the rest will come along. So what I'm looking to do is once we have this theory of dynamics of conscious agents worked out, there is no competition, there is no arrow of time, there is no limited resources in this theory of consciousness, but I want to find the specific projection, conditional probability projection, that gives me a view of it that looks like evolution by natural selection, nature red in tooth and claw, fighting to reproduce and so forth. That's the goal. So and that's what we want to, we want to see Newton as a special case of Einstein. We want to see, I want to see evolution with natural selection as a special case of a deeper theory of consciousness. And then whatever transcends that theory of consciousness needs, will be even deeper, but it needs to give back the theory of consciousness as a special case, right? So the work that we do usually doesn't just get tossed to the side. If it's just a fundamental, like there are some theories that were there was nothing to salvage. They were just wrong from the get-go. So phlogiston theories and so forth, right? They're just wrong from the get-go. So no reason to try to preserve them. But
I mean, they did. It did sort of show us like there's some fluid-like dynamics to heat transfer and so forth. I mean, it's not totally worthless.
Yeah, I mean, I think that the dynamics of it were maintained.
Like the caloric held on for a long time, even with the existence mathematical structures. It still sort of works, right? You only eventually realize that you can continually generate it,
and that's kind of interesting because what was maintained was the mathematical structure.
Yeah, I wanted to ask you: do you think that by increasing the fidelity of our theories, that what is the greater societal benefit of doing that, other than technology? Obviously, we can build cooler stuff, maybe, if we know more about how things work. But it seems like there's something more to this, right? There's some greater purpose to, like, for evolutionary theory. Like, somebody could say, "Who cares how we evolved or didn't?" But I have this intuition that it really does matter in terms of the way that our civilization unfolds on Earth and the way that we frame even political situations to ourselves and so forth. Well, do you have a sense of purpose with regards to pursuing these advanced evolutionary theories? Or
well, so I'll answer it first within the context of standard science right now. Evolution by natural selection and space-time being fundamental and so forth. Within that framework, we would want to have scientific theories simply so that we don't get lost in dogmatic blunders, right? It's very human nature being what it is, and I'm not speaking as like evolutionary psychology kind of thing. There are all sorts of selection pressures for us to not have true beliefs. I mean, I might want to impress you with how deep my beliefs are, so I could have all sorts of exotic beliefs just to impress you. And there's all sorts of selection pressures. It turns out to be a good cheater, you need to be able to deceive others. And the best deceiver is the one who's self-deceived, don't even know that you're deceiving. There's all sorts of reasons for us to have false beliefs. So one reason for scientific theories that are precise is that it forces us to state our ideas precisely and to state them so that with pointers to evidence that could disqualify your theory. What experiment could I do to show you wrong? And so even though scientists are just as dogmatic as anybody else on the planet, science as a social institution pits the scientists against each other so that as a social institution, it's not dogmatic, right? So space-time has been assumed to be fundamental for centuries in science. But when enough scientists really realized what quantum field theory, the work of Nima Arkhani-Hamed and his collaborators is doing, and then the work from evolution of natural, when they really realize it'll take a few decades, but just like with Newton, it took a few decades. It was over in 1900, and with Max Planck, and certainly by 1905 with Einstein's special, it was over for Newton. But it took decades for many physicists to recognize that. In 1922, when Einstein got the Nobel Prize, the committee said this is not for relativity theory. They didn't believe it. So it takes a while for even the best and brightest to really, and usually it takes just the new generation. The old generation dies and the new generation comes along and science moves along. So there's an answer at that level. We want to have precise theories to avoid dogmatism. We want to know what would make you wrong.
It's like a celebration of truth, right? It's this celebration that we as a species value what is objectively the case, so that it's perhaps a protection from an evolutionary standpoint against somebody trying to subvert reality for their own gains against the benefit of the population as a whole or something like that. I mean, it's interesting how in every single civilization you see truth and telling the truth, and even in like Western religion and just everywhere. I mean, the court system, like you swear on a Bible, right? Like it's like very, very important to our civilization to have the truth be revered and be our pillar from which we operate. And
absolutely,
it makes a lot of sense. Yeah.
And when we believe we have the truth, when we don't, all sorts of horrors happen. We see this when spirituality turns into religion, right? We see it in the Crusades. We see it in all sorts of terrible things that have been done in the name of God. because my beliefs are true and your beliefs are false, and then it turns out no, your beliefs are not true. I mean, the belief that leads you to kill other people is just deeply wrong. So we need science. Here's where I think science and spirituality could really help each other, right? To take the ideas from spiritual traditions, make them precise, and then avoid the dogmatism. We can actually look at where our ideas are incoherent and where they are coherent, and start to evolve what the spiritual traditions call better pointers. So they think of language as pointers to the spiritual realm. But could we use scientific, more precise pointers that avoid the peril of dogmatism, that tell you this is as far as this idea goes. This pointer stops right here, and it's limited right there. Every pointer is going to be limited. The only question is, does the pointer tell you its limits, or does it lead you to think that you're fundamentally right? If it leads you to think you're fundamentally right, then we're in trouble. If the pointer is precise enough to say, so far and no farther, the pointer is no longer valuable or valid beyond this point. That's how we're going to make progress in spirituality. So that's why I think science...
And in science, too. Like, I can listen to what you're saying about spirituality and be like, wow, if only scientists were capable... I'm not saying all of them aren't, but if only scientists as a whole, and really bureaucrats that parrot science, were capable of viewing science in that same light, that, whatever statement I'm making is almost certainly wrong, because we will learn something 100 years from now that totally invalidates what I'm saying, or at least modifies it to the degree that it's no longer recognizable.
Or creates an understanding where the thing that I'm saying is just a subset of what is. Because I think that that's something that people love these theories of everything, and they want to deeply hold on to the idea that they have discovered something fundamental that will never ever change, and people will carve their names in stones, and they will forever be remembered as being the one who discovered the truth with a capital T.
Right, and I think that the deepest scientists are quite aware that theory building is a never-ending game, that there can never be a theory of everything. That I agree that many scientists are dogmatic about their own theories. We're people with egos, and so
and we got to feed our families.
We got to feed our families, and the point of the joke is that you need to get tenure before people figure out what's wrong with your PhD, right? So that's that. So of course, what you've done is not the final word, but so I think most scientists recognize, in principle, that there's no theory of everything. We all are human beings, so we like our theory. It's our pet theory, and we're fighting for our theory against others. But as a social institution, science is not dogmatic. It may be slow moving, right? Physicalism, I think, is dead, but science won't recognize that it's dead for another couple decades. Many scientists, when they appear to be like impatient with people who are like questioning evolution and so forth, it could be not that they don't understand that evolution isn't the final word. They're impatient because the people that are bringing up stuff haven't done their homework. They're not yet on the playing field. The kinds of questions and things they're raising show that they haven't. It's like jumping into a conversation that you haven't listened to before. It's sort of rude, and to take on. I mean, of course, everybody has their own ideas, but to take on a world-class evolutionary theorist when you haven't actually taken a course in evolutionary theory is hubris. And so there is some impatience when a scientist sees someone who clearly has no idea what it is that they're trying to take down. They haven't done their homework yet. So you can get that kind of thing, but that's separate from that same person faced with a genuine colleague who has deep questions that are targeted to the core of their framework. That's a different story. Then they would say, "Oh, okay, hey, you got me there, or at least you made me have to think." So there's two different things going on here. It's dealing with people who are trying to play the game, but they haven't done their homework. Mm-hmm. And versus dealing with someone who is playing the game and is challenging me, okay, in that case, yeah, maybe I will have to give up some deep assumptions. That's something I wouldn't say to the general public, because what they're thinking is so far wrong that they'll just completely misunderstand if I concede anything. They just won't even understand. So you can see the problem that the scientist has there.
Yeah, this is something...
It seems like there's a really important part of discourse which involves understanding what the person is saying. And I guess that's what you're getting at. If you're not taking the time to understand what's up, then it's it just ends up being pointless.
Yeah, like
But I'm thinking about just this. I often talk about this with people we have on the show, especially people who are in the academy. Is what like it's very difficult. Oftentimes we'll have people from the academy who have new ideas that are maybe so far out there or so radical that they feel really that they don't have a place to even air them out. Like people will come on the show. Actually, we'll have conversations with people off camera sometimes too, where they'll have these really radical ideas, and then they're very afraid of bringing those in because maybe they haven't processed them with the.
I think because they don't have mathematical theories
That's
for
what I was
them. I
gonna
think
say.
that this is really foundational, which is that even inside of the academy, people develop ideas, but they don't know how to talk about them because they're intuitions. And there's this gap between what you can say based on intuition and what you can say after you have gone through and you have modeled it mathematically to be like, look, this is what my intuition says, and I can parameterize it for you so that you can hold it in your head and kind of twist it around and like think about the exact logical relationships I mean and be like, well, that doesn't make any sense because that's an impossible relationship, or be like, huh, that looks good.
Like I heard you say in another talk that when you first came into the academy, and I think it was in grad school, that talking about consciousness was essentially off the table. Like you just didn't do that.
Right.
What made that possible, and how can we open up discussions in other realms in the academy and in study in general? Like, can you imagine any implements that could make those more possible? Or how did you achieve that other people could use in their own fields of study where they want to approach radical concepts that maybe aren't on the table, so to speak?
Well, so what Anastasia was saying actually applies to me. So I'm the person who will often have these ideas, and I'm not a mathematician. I've studied mathematics, but I'm not a mathematician, and I know enough mathematics to be able to think conceptually about this, but not enough typically to prove it. There are some very elementary things I've proven, but it's very elementary. So what I do is, like with the evolutionary game stuff, I learned to do evolutionary game theory in computer simulations. That I can do. So I run simulations, my students run them, and we begin to say, that intuition might be right. Maybe we don't see the truth. Then I go to a real mathematician. I say, okay, so I go to Chetan Prakash and Manish Singh, and I say, and if I'm lucky, I get them interested because they're busy guys, right? They have all sorts of things to do, but they realize that this, maybe we don't see the truth. That's worth that's worth working on. So then we come up with these terms, and so that's what we have to do. If you have intuitions, you need to first do your own homework to get it advanced far enough along that it's worth wasting other people's time with your idea, right? Everybody has ideas. You need to do your own as much as you can do within your own capacity. Maybe you can write a program and simulate it and so forth, just to see if you're anywhere. But ultimately, yes, we want our precise theories. That's the name of the game here, is precise theories. And so if you can't do it yourself, like me, I'm one of those who can't do it myself, then you have to collaborate. And that's just the way it's played, because if you can't put a precise statement on the table, then you're not even in the game, right? That's when you're in the game, is when you say something that's absolutely precise. Until then, you're
and
not.
Is that and did you use that? Did you first find a way to put it in precise language and then recruit collaborators on the basis of that, to the point that you actually had, like, at what was the day where you felt comfortable going into the academic setting and discussing these ideas? Was that after you'd already formed some sort of coalition, or what was the process like?
Well, even before we had this theorem that Chetan proved, and I published a paper with my graduate students in 2010 in the Journal of Theoretical Biology, which is one of the premier journals in this area, where we had just done the genetic algorithms and the evolutionary game simulations. So we'd done extensive simulations. So this was not a proof, and we were very clear. But we were making pretty strong claims. We were saying, look, this is pretty remarkable. And it was good enough that the journal accepted it, right? So it was not yet a proof, but the simulations were so were so strong. And by the way, the reason we could do that was because a mathematician named John Maynard Smith, a British mathematician in the 1970s, took Darwin's idea and said, you know what? it's Darwin's idea is a wonderful idea, but it's informal. We need to make it mathematically precise. And so he used the tools of game theory and Darwin's ideas to come up with what we call evolutionary game theory. And so the reason I could do what I did was because a mathematician had done the hard work of saying, let's take Darwin and make him mathematically rigorous. And then a guy named Martin Nowak at Harvard wrote a book in like the mid-2000s that I could read. So he made it accessible to someone with my lack of ability so that I could actually read and understand it, and then my students and I could write the simulation. And so you can see how scientists are helping each other. Darwin has this beautiful, empirically strong theory. John Maynard Smith comes along many decades later, turns it into precise mathematics. Nowak dumbs it down so Hoffman can understand it. Then Hoffman and his graduate students run their little simulations and go, wow, maybe we don't see the truth. And then Hoffman goes to a real mathematician and he proves it. So that's you see how it takes a long time because that rigor is required. So you need rigor and intuitions. And some of us, like me, don't really have the mathematics. We have a little mathematics, just enough to get in trouble, not enough to get out, but enough to have intuitions. And then we go and we work with mathematicians on this.
I love the transgenerational collaboration
Yes.
that you're so keenly aware of here. It's always struck. I mean, obviously, standing on the shoulders of giants and so forth, but I love that you see the building of that coalition as not something that happened in the halls while you're at grad school, but something across all of the ages.
Absolutely. That really is it. If you look back, all of us are wrong. But some of us are wrong in really valuable ways. Darwin is extremely valuable, even if evolutionary theory ends up being just a special case of something deeper. And the work of John Maynard Smith was absolutely critical. Nowak's work and by the way, Nowak didn't just codify it. Nowak has made original contributions himself to that theory. And so yes, that's the beauty of this kind of scientific progress. If you look at it, Darwin had these intuitions, but he wasn't mathematically strong. He couldn't have turned it into mathematics. But over decades, we turned it into something that could come back and say, you know what? The very notion of organisms, living versus non-living, that was Darwin's intuition. We can actually show that must not be a fundamental distinction. That's not a principal distinction. We need a deeper theory in which the distinction between living and non-living, which Darwin took as given, is not a fundamental distinction. But it was Darwin being as precise as he could with that idea of life and the evolution of life, and then the mathematical work that we did that comes back and says, you know what? The whole thing itself means that the distinction between living and non-living is not principled. We need a deeper theory. So that's the beauty of scientific theories, is they're so precise, they tell you their limits. They tell you where they stop. And that's why I want to see them in spirituality as well. There's very, very important concepts and personal issues that are going on in the spiritual realm. Why should we cheat ourselves of this valuable cross-generational tool we have of evolving our pointers, avoiding dogmatism, and finding the limits of our current conceptions? That's the beauty of. So I think that science went on this physicalist jag for several centuries. And it apparently had to, because we really needed to do something in a much smaller sphere, like just space and time, which isn't the final. We just had to really sharpen the tools in space and time. Once we sharpened the tools, we realized, whoa, one of the big insights is that space and time itself isn't the final thing. We thought it was the final thing. No, it's just one of endless theories that we're going to have. Now can we do the same thing, that same idea with spirituality?
It makes me think of how there's this other scale to which these principles that you're investigating could be occurring. Like, it's interesting to me that you've collaborated with folks who are trying to understand these really microscopic processes and how they relate to the emergence of consciousness. We've had a few interesting folks on the show, like David Grinspoon, who wrote a paper with Adam Frank and Sarah Walker about planetary scale consciousness. And it got us thinking about communities of conscious and planets, and we were really far out there. And I wonder if you've toyed around with collaborating with folks who are looking at cosmological scale or astrophysical scale processes in terms of, because there's all these really interesting crises in astrophysics and cosmology.
Dark matter.
Dark matter being a great example, where it's like, oh, we can't explain this thing in terms of basic physical attraction, gravity or something. So, but it would be very easy to explain if you just introduced some Olaf Stapledon ideas like, the stars are doing what they want to be doing, basically, which is complete heresy as far as I understand it. But I wonder if there wouldn't be some astrophysicists that would entertain ideas coming from a mathematically rigorous standpoint like the one you're generating.
Well, astrophysicists are going to justifiably want a mathematically precise statement of these new ideas, and they're going to want to see how the current well-known and accepted laws of astrophysics fall out of the deeper theory. And so if you have some kind of Gaia kind of hypothesis or consciousness spread across planets, and you can make it mathematically precise, and you can predict, the density and distribution of dark matter as a result of it, and so forth, then and only then will you be taken seriously, right? What they will say is, you're a smart guy, a smart woman. It's fun to talk with you about this over beer. Get back to me when you actually have a scientific theory, and I'll be happy to then, So but I'm happy to talk with you now, but this isn't serious, right? Until you have my own take on it, though, is that we can't go there from within space-time. If you want to understand how planets and so forth, bigger entities are related to consciousness, you have to step outside of space-time altogether, get a theory of consciousness qua consciousness, show precisely how one projection of it, not the only, one of countless projections, is what we call space-time. Right? You can see where I'm going with this. If we start within space-time, that's just one projection of countless of this deeper theory of consciousness. So there's no way that we could have gotten the deep insights of. So we need a theory of consciousness qua consciousness, a projection down into one trivial interface that we call space-time, and in that interface look at what the planetary motion, how that's related to what we know about the conscious dynamics in the deeper theory. I think we have to do all of that work for this to actually pan out. So I'm not saying that they're wrong. I think that you cannot do it from within space-time and trying to boot up consciousness from planets. You got to go completely outside space-time, consciousness qua consciousness, and project down to space-time as one trivial application of your deeper theory.
Is this a simulation theory, fundamentally?
Good question. So simulation theory, as proposed, for example, by Nick Bostrom and colleagues, has something similar to what I'm saying and something profoundly different. So I'll talk first about where it's similar. It's similar in saying that what you're seeing around you is not the final reality. There's something deeper, and you're not seeing the truth. So you're just wearing a headset kind of thing. So we're very similar in that regard. Where we're profoundly different is what the way Bostrom puts it out is that there is some base level, there's some programmer in some base level that's creating the first simulation, and the creatures in the simulated creatures in that can then write their own programs and make the new level and so forth. So we're somewhere higher up in level. But his bottom level is a physicalist space-time level, right? So he's saying space and time, he's assuming that they're fundamental, and he's assuming that a physical system like a computer made out of circuits and software could somehow create consciousness. And so I'm disagreeing with two important points. I think that space-time is not fundamental. And so the very base of his whole simulation theory is the wrong base. And second, the claim that unconscious circuits and software could give rise to consciousness is a very strong claim. A lot of people have made the claim, and there are no scientific theories anywhere close to supporting it. It's a conjecture with no scientific theory behind it whatsoever.
The idea that you could have this self-reflective awareness of experience to come from just atoms bumping into each other.
That's right, and I should really clarify what I just said there. So many again of my brilliant friends and colleagues are proposing these theories that somehow when you get the right kinds of circuits and software, you will have consciousness come up. So there's integrated information theory, global workspace theory, there's attentional schema theory, orchestrated collapse of microtubule. There's all sorts of, and many of the people involved in these are my friends or colleagues, and they're brilliant. There's not a but that's on the positive. Now here's the downside. What I ask them is, okay, you think that, these physical systems that you're proposing can create conscious experiences. So give me one. What is the orchestrated collapse of microtubules that must be the taste of chocolate? What is the integrated information that must be the smell of a lemon? What is the attentional schema state that must be the illusion of the filling of an itch? What is the global workspace state that must be the illusion or give you the experience of a headache? There is
the brain is a weird thing where it's like you can open the brain case and you can poke at it and you can make somebody smell something or taste something or see something. And so does that change if there's a physical deformation that's possible to induce the taste of chocolate, does that change your perspective on the emergence from the physical structure, or is that just another projection that is incidentally appearing to be physical in nature? Right.
So this is a very, very natural question that I get. All the people email me and so forth and say, look, right, if you stimulate area V4, you get color phosphines, right? So put a magnet and stimulate area V4 here on your skull, you'll see all these psychedelic colors, and when I turn the magnet off, you don't see them. Or if I inhibit your skull, V4 by the magnet here, you will lose all color experience in the right visual field. It just turns to black and white. So clearly, clearly the brain must be causing the conscious experiences, because I manipulate this, and right. Well, as soon as I change the state of the brain, your conscious experiences change, and it seems very, very compelling. But think about it in virtual reality. Suppose virtuality, and I have a virtual steering wheel. There's no real steering wheel. I've got a virtual steering wheel, and I'm playing a race car game, right? So I've got this virtual steering wheel, and I see a red Porsche to my right and a white Camaro to my left, and I'm racing them. And I notice that when I turn my steering wheel to the left, my car goes to the left. When I turn it to the right, my car goes to the right. And therefore I say the steering wheel is real, and it has real causal effects. It really caused my car to turn to the left. Well, no, the steering wheel only exists when you look. As soon as I turn my headset away, there is no steering wheel. I only see the steering wheel when I look at it. And so what evolution has given us is a headset that gives us the illusion of causality, but we get taken in by it.
But the steering wheel is still there in the sense that if you turn your head and then you steer, you still go.
Right, but it's very, very clear that there. So I'm seeing, for example, I have a green shiny steering wheel in front of me, and I ask myself, so that's just in my headset, right? That's just what I see in my headset. What is in this metaphor? What is the reality? Well, it's some supercomputer somewhere. So is there some green shiny wheel inside that supercomputer? No, it's silly. So what's really doing the causal work? It's the supercomputer, right? The green wheel is doing no causal work, but it looks to me to play the game, I should act as though the steering wheel has causal powers. And that's the whole point of the game, is to give you bells and whistles that give you a useful fiction of causality.
So what is the supercomputer here?
The universe.
Yes.
Yeah, well, it can't be because the universe is in space-time, and so it has to be something that's beyond space-time.
Exactly.
So what is the supercomputer?
Well, that's why I'm working on this theory of conscious agents. Right.
Oh, excellent.
Right, so the theory, and again, what I've said about all theories applies to my theory. There is no theory of everything. So I'm just taking the next baby step. But the baby step that I'm taking is to say, let's have this informal idea that consciousness is fundamental. And let me take the first baby step to make that formal with my little theory of conscious agents. And let's see what that theory can do. If my baby theory of conscious agents, which of course is not the final word on consciousness. I'll be the first one to say this is like 1.0, and I can't wait to see 1 million.0, right? So this is just 1.0. But let's see what this baby theory says. But before it can even be a baby theory, we better show that we can get space and time as projections of this baby theory of consciousness. So I'm looking for something beyond space-time, namely consciousness, where consciousness is just a word, and my theory of conscious agents is just the first baby theory of unpacking that word in a precise way, making it rigorous in a precise way. But that means that everything that we see here is just an interface, and it gives us the useful fiction of causal ability. And that also fits with evolutionary theory. Evolution gave us symbols that guide adaptive behavior, period. They give us useful fictions of causality, but not true causality.
Does that make, in your analysis, does that make death and life fictions? Is there,
yes.
Is it like, interesting.
Yes.
So can
that's a point that I'm wrestling with myself, because it's I should say psychologically I wrestle with my stuff all the time. It's so counterintuitive to me. I mean, I'm as physicalist in my bones as anybody else on the planet. I mean, death is a real thing.
You kick the rock, so to speak.
I'm sorry?
You kick the rock, so to speak.
Yeah, exactly right. So, yeah, I kick the rock just like, right, Johnson, just like Johnson did to Berkeley. But, I don't know, my own attitude is that the consciousness is the fundamental thing, and therefore, as you were saying, the distinction we make between living and non-living is not principled, and therefore, I really have to, I haven't thought my way all the way through this, but it seems to me that death is going to be something like just taking off your headset. It's like I'm this. One way to think about this situation, as I'm thinking about it now, is I'm just a person. I go into a virtual reality arcade. I put on a headset, and I'm now immersed in some new world that may be completely different from anything I normally see. And after a while, I get lost in it. Right? It's so immersive that I forget that I'm just wearing a headset. And maybe it's a fighting game, so someone's shooting at me, and I get these visceral reactions. I'm afraid and so forth. And I'm afraid I'm going to die in the game. But then when I wake up, I realize, well, I can just take the headset off, and there's no big deal. Maybe that's what it's like. Maybe consciousness is completely immersing itself on purpose into this game, letting itself get lost in it completely as a learning. I mean, it's part of learning. And this is quite, if you think about it, this is quite the headset. This is what right now the universe is estimated to be 93 billion light years across, or something, or maybe infinity, but 93 billion is something like the observable. There's trillions of stars and galaxies out there. This is truly, truly impressive. And I come feeling like this little 160-pound tiny entity in this billions of light years across universe, some tiny thing. And then I wake up and realize, oh no, this is just a headset. And I'm not tiny entity in this. I'm, in some sense, the one running this simulation. That's somehow how consciousness comes to know itself more and more deeply.
Is it fundamentally God? Is it a different concept than God? Like, is it fundamentally deistic? Like, the simulation theories in general seem to strike me as
God with like a lowercase?
Yeah, not in some churchy sense, but like in some sense of a unifying actor that binds all of the objects in existence.
That is not of the world, but creates the world.
Well, so the notion of God or Brahman is something that's been in human thought for a long time. And what's remarkable is that has remained an intuitive concept. There's not been any mathematical models, no mathematically precise statement of what we mean.
Newton would have killed for that.
Newton spent more time on theology than he did on physics.
That's right.
And the typical intuitions about God. So I was raised. My father was a minister, a Protestant fundamentalist minister. So I thought, to the extent that I thought about God at all, was he was someone very really powerful. Maybe he had white hair. Maybe it's sort of like the thing that you see, in the Vatican. Michelangelo's painting God and Adam and so forth. Um, the notions from the Eastern, and that was my child view. As you get older, you think, well, God is okay. He's not that old man. He's not got a white beard and so forth. But there is some notion that maybe it's an object. God is some kind of object or something. I don't know. And maybe he's pissed off at me. I don't know. There's all these things going on. But then you have the Eastern traditions, which say that, and they differ too, but some of them, they say that there's not one entity. They talk about non-duality, but there's not one God. And even Christianity talks about, the Trinity. So God is not just one, but three, and then there's even notions of seven in the Bible and so forth. So from my point of view as a human being, a spiritual human being, and a scientist, these various traditions, I think, have useful pointers, but the pointers are limited. And what I want to do is to start fallibly, and of course wrong, to make mathematically precise statements. And so in the theory of conscious agents, it turns out when two conscious agents interact, they satisfy the definition of a conscious agent. So I'm forced by my model to say that they also now are one conscious agent.
Conscious agent is this idea that there is some kind of input, a receiving, an action that affects the input. And so there's basically this cyclical relationship between perception, action, and sort of like perception prime.
Right. So just without going into the mathematics, just the idea is that in our theory of consciousness, right, there's lots of things that you could throw in to talk about consciousness, but as a scientist, you want the minimal. You want to find the minimal set of assumptions. So we have two big assumptions. There are conscious experiences, like the taste of chocolate, color green as an experience, and so forth. So there are conscious experiences and subjects that have those experiences, and the experiences of one subject can affect the experiences of other subjects. Those are our assumptions. So notice there's nothing about learning, memory, problem solving, intelligence, self, the will, free will. None of those are all things I have to build. If I want them, I have to build them out of networks of interacting conscious agents. But so basically, the basic idea of conscious agents is something is experiencing, and those experiences affect other experiencers and their experiences. That's the bottom line. So when I write this down mathematically, it turns out when I have these two conscious agents interacting, they also satisfy my definition of a conscious agent. So they are, according to the theory tells me that they are a conscious agent. That's what the theory, it comes back and tells me. Actually, I didn't plan it that way, but it was the mathematics that came back and told me and said they are conscious agents. Okay, so, but now it turns out, here's the kicker, which is really, so my theory already tells me that I can never have a complete theory in the following way. When I take thousands of agents, have them interact, well, there are tons and tons of combinations that you can have. And you can have infinitely many combinations. But it turns out that there is not just one notion of infinity. A guy named Gregor Cantor, in the 19th century, showed that there is not just one infinity, there's 2, 3, 4, 5, to infinity. There's infinitely many different kinds of, each next one is infinitely bigger than the ones below it. And so there's this infinite Cantor's hierarchy of infinities. So here's now getting to your question about God. When I put conscious agents together, I can jump up to a higher level of the Cantor hierarchy. So I'm to the infinite, but I'm not to the infinite. I'm just to the next infinite. Now I can take what was called its power set of combinations. I get to the next. So this never ends. What that means is we can study I'm studying the bottom level. I'm not even thinking about infinity right now. I'm just trying to get 2 or 3 agents to work together. So I'm just a midget. I'm just doing the little stuff. But we're going to eventually start dealing. When I get real mathematicians working, they'll deal with the first level of infinity, and we'll have the second level, and this will go on. So this is incredible job security. But it means that you can see why humility is required at every step of I'm fidgeting with the little bells and whistles at the level 0. There, I see the infinite hierarchy ahead, and who knows what kinds of new things we'll see at each level. I'm not smart enough to know. This is going to be fun to explore, and maybe that's what we mean by God. But notice, I'm giving the most mathematically, if I'm anywhere near the right track, I'm giving the most mathematically precise statement about quote unquote God that's ever been given, and I'm already telling you, it's telling me that I'm nowhere, that I can't get there. It's all, and that's the power of trying to do things with mathematical precision. It comes back and says humility is required at every step of the way. Here's how far this goes and no farther. But
it seems like God has always been trying to contextualize human life in reference to everything, which, because everything is an impossible to define set of features, is a doomed failure. Like, it's never satisfying at the end of the day.
It just recedes constantly.
Exactly, yeah.
Well, and that's really part of a deep teaching of many spiritual traditions, right? Is that if you identify yourself with anything inside space and time, your body, your wealth, your knowledge, your physical prowess, your athletic ability, your job, I'm a president of such and such. If you identify yourself with any of that's like having a virtual
Pain
reality
City.
Oh, sorry?
Suffering City.
That's right.
Yeah.
You induce suffering, and it's the suffering because it's false. You're not that. And if you identify yourself with something that's a trivial aspect of you, as opposed to realizing that you're the deeper reality on which that's just a little simulation. So in some sense, the spiritual traditions are saying, look, wake up. This is just a headset. If you identify yourself with anything inside the headset, you're going to have suffering because that's not who you are, and you're going to feel vulnerable, right, to everything inside the headset, when in fact you're the deeper reality on which that's just a little one of countless simulations that you could run. That's just one of countless.
But the danger is that it's also important that you mind your simulation very tightly, right? Because there's going to be ramifications for my actions throughout this universe in terms of other people's experiences. And, I can't just be a psychopath and so forth, because that's actually gonna lead to ripples throughout all of these other conscious experiences as well.
Because it's like, I think that's the premise of, did you ever watch the series Westworld?
Some, yes. I mean, not all of them, but some of them, yeah.
But I think that was kind of the core of the idea, which is that if you enter into a place where you are in a simulated environment where consequences don't hold because the agents that you encounter are not agents that warrant moral consideration, what darkness emerges from that? And so if you have a theory of consciousness, which is that this is a simulation and reality lies elsewhere and truth lies elsewhere, I think that's what you're getting at, yeah? It's
just, it has a danger to be, it has a danger of being abused, that philosophy, if it's not, if there's not some reverence for the ongoings within the day-to-day, as perhaps small and insignificant as they may be in the grand scheme of things. I think we saw this with like the hippie movement in the 60s with this like back to the East thing, where people are just kind of like, anything goes or whatever. And it's like a lot of people's lives got destroyed as a result of that. And I've seen it happen like amongst people I've known in my own lifetime who sort of get into this idea that, there's almost a nihilism that can result from thinking like this.
Right. I think you both are raising a very deep and important issue here. And it's one that I've started to think about, but I think that I have to think a lot more about. It seems one fact is that everything dies. It's just a matter of when.
And suddenly weird, strange ways that don't quite make sense. Like the line between life and death is arbitrary.
Not just the bad guys.
Yeah.
So death is guaranteed. The only issue is when and how. And it certainly, I agree that wanton murder is wrong, and that instead, as many of religious traditions say, love your neighbor as yourself should be the rule of the road. I mean, that's really what's. Nevertheless, what's interesting to me is that murders do occur. Love your neighbor as yourself isn't widely. It's rare. It's there, but it's rare. And but in many cases, someone could have a really what we'd call a terrible, unprincipled, evil life, and maybe they're on death row, and they wake up, and all of a sudden they wake up and realize, oh wow, that was wrong, but that wasn't me. That was something else, and ultimately, if it's true that you're going to just be taking off the headset, and there is just one of us, it's just the one consciousness. It's really exploring its possibilities, including letting itself beat up itself, leaving that possibility. There's something that I think I read in C.S. Lewis. I forgot which book it was, but I think he was talking about, he was in like World War I or something like that, and as you probably know, C.S. Lewis was a deep intellect, but he was also a Christian apologist. So he wrote for Mere Christianity, for example, and so forth. But one thing that Lewis said that struck me was that he said that if he shot a German soldier in World War I, he said we both got up and shot each other and killed each other at the same time. He said, my feeling is that we would then, right after death, I would go up and shake his hand. We'd laugh. It would be a big joke, and we would just move on. And that really, I mean, that for me, it just like came out of the blue when Lewis said that. But thinking about this headset idea makes me think, yeah. So in the headset, yes, we should always urge our children and have the laws: don't kill. Instead, learn to love. But killing does happen, and people hate. But that's part of the growing up process, and so the both seem to be necessary. So you can see I haven't wrapped my head around it completely. I'm not saying that everything I've said is coherent, but there seem to be different strands and threads that need to be pulled together to have a deeper understanding. In space-time, yes, it's wrong to kill. It's wrong, but at a deeper level, maybe you learn something when you pull your headset off, and consciousness learns something deeper. I'm not saying I'm right about that. I'm not saying I'm doctrinaire about it. I'm just saying these are the things I'm thinking about, and maybe I'll back away from that. I don't know.
I could see it in the context of being part of the exploration in terms of instructing even a more fertile exploratory grounds for the conscious agents in the future.
Yes.
Wow,
I feel very fallible on that point, by the way, very fallible.
I mean, I think that it's a
Appreciate that.
really, really difficult point, right? Because when you start thinking, because I'm sitting here and I'm thinking about space-time as having these, 4 dimensions, and then thinking of something that exists outside of that, and what it seems to me, what you're suggesting is that each iteration of some form inside of space-time is really just a kind of a bleb on the surface of this one consciousness, where it kind of is a resonant structure that kind of stands and dances for a while, and then it recedes back into it, and that larger unitary thing. It's hard to call it a thing because things have location in space, and so what do you call it? It's not a thing. What is it?
Well, first, I think the way you would just put it is very, very good. I think that's we're trying to grapple with something that's really hard to grapple with, and that was a good way to do it. So different traditions call it different things. So in Christianity, they call it God. In Hinduism, I think Brahma or something like that, and it's other traditions say it's the non-dual. So there's not one, but it's not many. So they try to get at it that way.
Interesting.
So yeah, I don't know.
There does seem to be a lot of piecemeal evidence that people reach out and they touch something that isn't of this world. Right? The idea of the near-death experience of the children that are born with some kind of evidence of a past life, of this kind of cross-body memory. And we see it on the level of humans, and it's harder to tell if it's on the memory of cats or something as well, but who knows?
So the world, the idea of previous lives and so forth, there are many examples where people have those thoughts, and actually I know some people who have that I trust, that I think are smart people that have had these experiences themselves. So I don't know what to make of them yet. If I take them as data, that will be very, very interesting as a constraint on the theory of conscious agents and how we project the dynamics of conscious agents down into space-time and entities within space-time. So ultimately, we may be able to find mathematically that our theory of conscious agents and projection into space-time can be written to allow this kind of thing to be real. And so I would be very, very interested. It would be the nice thing about it is the mathematics. If it can rule it out, then we can just say, well, this theory rules that out. So maybe that means my theory is wrong. Oops, I got stuck on here. Maybe my theory is wrong, or it's just not possible. These are just illusions that people have, even though they're brilliant and reliable people. We can all be wrong. So we'll see. My own attitude about this is to not be doctrinaire either way, to not rule them in and not rule them out. So I'm not credulous about them. I don't just say yes, but I don't just say no. I say until we have a mathematically precise theory, it's not clear what to do with these things, right? And that's also, I have many friends who work in psi research, looking for paranormal phenomena, like trying to get consciousness to change random number generator, or to get some kind of precognition in a psychological experiment. And again, many of them are good friends of mine and brilliant colleagues. But I've told them this myself, that unless there's a mathematical theory, no scientist is going to take it seriously, right? If you can get some data that seems to suggest that there was you changed the 10th digit in the random number generator, well, if there's no theory that predicts that, maybe, if we try to replicate it a few times, we won't be able to replicate it. Who knows? But my attitude, it goes even deeper, is they're trying to say, most of my colleagues who do that have an idea that they want to show that consciousness can do something. And I'm all for that. I think consciousness is real and it can do something. But they also think that there is a machine, the space-time physics machine. And the laws of physics are doing most of the work in their view. But there is a little ghost in the machine. It's a pretty wimpy ghost. It doesn't have very big biceps, but it can move that 10th decimal place in the random number generator, and it can do little things. And my attitude is, you're not thinking big enough. The machine, it's what you think of as the machine, is only a headset description of what consciousness itself is really doing. Consciousness is the whole thing. We don't need, in some sense, I don't need to have paranormal phenomena. The laws of physics themselves are exactly how consciousness works. It's all about consciousness. So I don't need a little ghost in the machine. And it would be perfectly fine with me if it turned out that by trying with conscious will, you can't move them random. No big deal, because everything that we do and see in space and time is nothing but consciousness moving. So I don't need the little ghost, because the whole quote unquote machine is just a projection of the power of the ghost. So you can see that it's a very, very different attitude.
That was almost biblical sounding right there.
Right.
I mean, these are fascinating ideas. They connect deeply to me to other conversations that we've had. We recently interviewed the director of the Qualia Research Institute, who's looking at these resonant structures inside of the brain that evoke certain states of being. They're basically looking for the resonant state inside the brain that is chocolate. And to me, it seems possible that there's, it's the same thing of the water flowing over the rock in the river, that rock underneath somewhere is causing the resonance.
Michael Levin too.
Michael Levin. And then there was also, we spoke a lot about natural selection and the fact that there's no theories to work with beyond it. But we spoke with a guy, Richard Watson of Southampton, and he's working on a theory of natural induction, which is basically a parallel theory to natural selection, which is ways that systems work to actually decrease tension and to create greater harmony between each other as a method of finding ways to live with each other, as opposed to this, nature is red in tooth and claw. And so it immediately connects to all of these ideas, and I think that it's a fascinating move into the future, because we've been sitting around with paradigms that are almost a century old at this point.
Well, you've raised
some older.
Some very, very good points there about the research on the neural correlates of consciousness. So there's a lot of good research going on. What kinds of brain activity are correlated with, like, the taste of chocolate or the color experience and so forth. And there's been a lot of brilliant research on that. Christoph Koch and Francis Crick are famous for sort of pushing that line of research, and Christoph is doing that work. And when Christoph sees me, he says, "Don, you should be working on the brain." and I'm really glad for all the people who are doing that. I think Christoph is doing wonderful work, and we need to really understand and nail down all these neural correlates of consciousness. Really important to do. But on the other hand, once we have these correlates, we go, okay, so area V4, when it suppose area V4, when it has this kind of dynamics, this kind of oscillation, that gives you green 33. And when we have this kind of oscillation, that's now red 52. Okay, so that's the data to be explained. What explanation is going to start with that kind of dynamics of neural activity, and say, for principled reasons, that dynamical activity must be red 33. It could not be red 55. What theory is going to do that? No one has any clue. No one has ever proposed one, and I think it's in principle impossible. You cannot start with unconscious ingredients and boot up consciousness. I'll just lay it flat out. You cannot do it. But I have brilliant colleagues who are working on it, and I think that they should. By the way, my attitude is I want the neural correlates of consciousness, not because I think brain activity causes consciousness. I don't think brain activity causes anything. In fact, I don't have a brain right now. Brains don't exist unless they're perceived. Brain is a structure. This is a VR headset, right? I only see the stuff only exists when you see it. So when you look inside my skull, yeah, you would see neurons and brains. But until you look, they aren't there because you don't create them. So neurons don't even exist when they're not perceived. Just like
but the function of the neuron is
it's like you're defining
sustained.
Existence by perception as well.
Yeah, because it's the same thing as inside the supercomputer with the car. Like, you look away from the steering wheel and it's not rendered anymore, but the function of what it does is there. Yeah,
exactly right. So I get this kind of email all the time as well. It says, well, why don't you step in front of a train, right? If you think the train
that seems like an aggressive email.
I don't usually answer those emails.
but the idea would be, suppose, okay, I'm standing on the track, the train is coming at me, but all I need to do, since the train only exists when I look, I'll just look away. So there's no train. And then someone says, and what will happen to you? Well, absolutely. The train is gone, but the interface, the train is a symbol to some reality beyond space and time that I do need to pay attention to. It's just that whatever that reality is isn't a train. And whatever that reality is going to have consequences for me. So that's the point in all this. And so the neural correlates of consciousness, no one has ever succeeded in giving a theory for one specific conscious experience, saying this is the neural or silicon circuit that must be the taste of chocolate and could not be anything else. There's nothing, and this is, by the way, these are Nobel Prize winners and brilliant people that have been working on this for decades. There's not one success. So
And you take that to be like basically that the taste of chocolate would be encoded differently in each brain, as opposed to there being just like a plug and play circuit of the taste of chocolate that works the same in everybody's brain. Because I mean, I worked in a laboratory when I was in grad school where the goal was to be able to record and control the behavior of neurons. And so the idea eventually would be to be able to like put a shank into somebody's brain and to be able to say that in this brain, this is the pattern that gives the taste of chocolate, and I can activate it to give the taste of chocolate back. But I would imagine
in somebody else's brain.
But I imagine that it wouldn't work in somebody else's brain, because I think that that's kind of what I'm interpreting you to say.
Yeah,
is
I
that
think
there's
there'll
not
be broad similarities, but precise differences that you would need to do if you're going to make a brain set that's going to actually control someone, or give them the experience that they want. But notice, even if you come up with a headset that actually succeeds, and when I do this to the person, I know they're going to say that they're tasting chocolate, and they do. And I know that they're going to now say that they see a car, and they do. That's great. It doesn't mean the brain is doing it. And it doesn't mean that you have that the brain is causing those experiences. All it means is that you now have learned how to use the interface. It doesn't even mean that the brain exists when it's not perceived, because unless you actually look and see your thing, interacting with the brain, that's not actually. There is no brain. There is no device interacting with it until you actually look. There is some deeper reality that we code as brains and devices interacting with brains. That reality is there. But my interface description is only there when I turn my interface headset to it. So the language of brains and neural activity is ultimately just the language of our headset, and there's no true causality there.
Do you think that explains things that remain unexplained right now? Is that it seems to complicate things? Does it simplify things as well?
Well, it does seem to complicate things. So Philip Goff, who's a brilliant philosopher, and
he's promised to come on the show in the fall. So Philip Goff,
for the fall.
He's promised for the fall, but no definite commitment yet. So I'm putting it out there.
Oh, great, yeah. So he's got a panpsychist theory, and when he talks about in a new book that's coming out about what my project is, which is to get this theory of consciousness beyond space-time, and then show how its dynamics can give rise to space-time, and so forth. He says that's a huge project. Why don't you just put consciousness inside the laws of physics? So we'll say that mental events or conscious events and physical events are not different. They are one and the same thing. And so that means, for example, that there really is a space-time, there really are particles, and that really is how consciousness works. And of course, his approach would be much easier than mine. The problem is that space-time is doomed. The physicists are telling us that that ain't fundamental. So if you tag your theory, if you attach your theory of consciousness to a framework that the physicists are telling you is dead, well, that's not good for your theory. So that's why we have to do this extra work. No one said it's going to be easy, and so Philip is right. It's a Herculean task. But the physicists have told us that space-time is doomed, and evolution by natural selection agrees. So the reason I'm not a panpsychist of that stripe is because if I tie consciousness to the physical properties that we know now in space and time, I am guaranteed to be wrong. I'm guaranteed to be wrong. The nice thing about science is you're never done. You never have the final theory of everything, but at least you can know when you're wrong. You can add you put it this way: your own theories are telling you you're wrong. So you either have to then disbelieve your own theory, which means then you need your own better theory. So what happens when your theory tells you you're wrong? If you're going to disbelieve your theory, then you owe yourself a deeper theory, or better theory. So the reason I'm not a panpsychist is because panpsychists are doing something that our best theories tell us is deeply wrong, is fundamentally wrong, and cannot be rescued. It's completely wrong. So, but our theories are the physicists are saying now we can go beyond space-time, like Nima Arkhani-Hamed. They're finding structures beyond space-time, and so as if I was going to try to tie consciousness to anything, I'd be trying to tie it to these deeper structures beyond space-time, not to the structures inside space-time that the physicists are already saying are not fundamental.
And still, it seems at the end of the day, you're collaborating still on the project of unifying physics and consciousness.
Absolutely.
Just not through the extant structures.
Not through the extant structures, because the physicists are telling us don't go there. That's space-time is doomed. Now, I should say one other thing, though, about what I'm doing that Philip talks about and points out looks like it's self-refuting. So here's what I'm doing that looks like it's self-refuting. On the one hand, I'm saying I use evolution by natural selection, and I come up with this amazing theorem that we don't see the truth. So I'm looking around here, I don't see the truth. And then Hoffman comes along later and says, but when I look at people, I can see their conscious states a little bit. I can see if you're happy or sad, or if you're interested or not. So what gives here? If evolution says we don't see the truth, and yet now you're saying that I can see through my interface truly about your conscious state, I've shot myself in the foot. I've got a self-contradiction. And so it's a great point by Philip. It's great of him to point that idea out. And what you have to understand is that this is a two-step thing. So I start with the evolution by natural selection theory, because it's the best theory we have. And to my surprise, it says, what you're seeing isn't the truth. Then I say, well, what is the truth? And evolutionary theory says, can't help you with that. All I can tell you is, whatever the truth is, you ain't seeing it. That's all I can tell you. So now I say, okay, that's what my theory told me. This is an interface. It's not the truth. And it won't tell me an interface to what. So I'm going to make a leap. I'm going to say it's an interface to consciousness. Okay. That means that my interface is now, so notice I'm taking a step beyond evolutionary theory. This is not entailed by evolutionary theory. Evolutionary theory just got me to the interface, but it didn't get me beyond the interface. Now I have to make the creative leap and say, what's beyond the interface? I don't know. Let's try consciousness. If it's consciousness, then there are certain icons in the interface, like your face and your body, that are giving me fallible but non-trivial insight into the nature of consciousness. If I hit your hand with a hammer and you say, ouch, then I suspect that maybe the consciousness on the other side of that interface is feeling pain. We're hit, a rock with a hammer, get no feedback, then who knows? I mean, I don't know. But notice now it's not shooting myself in the foot. It's a two-step. This is the way science works. You first use your current best theories to find their limit. Then you say, new theory, beyond. And then, so it looks like a contradiction, but no, this is just the way science works. You find the limits of your theory, so you don't see the truth. It's just an interface. We thought when I saw a rock, that's because there really is a rock in objective reality. There's not. Rock is just an interface.
What I would add to that, though, is that though the rock is an interface symbol versus the living being, and the living being reacts to the hammer and the rock does not, you'd probably have to hit the rock with a hammer that was significant on its own timescales in order to be able to see it do something. And like the biogeochemical cycles of biology show that most rocks are of living organisms. There are those that are igneous and so they're not, but everything beyond that is basically coming from life and being digested by life and being transformed into the things that we identify as being alive, which will eventually also transform. And so there is a hammer, metaphorically, that is large enough that you can hit that rock with, such as, PFAS and BPA and pollution from tires and whatever else, acid rain, whatever it is that we're putting into the world, that actually does cause it to say ow, but I don't know that we can hear the ow.
That's a really interesting point, one that I've thought about as well, and it's going to be a very deep thing to ask in the context of the theory. So once we get the theory of conscious agents and how it maps into space and time and gives us what we call physical objects and gives us this whole hierarchy from elementary particles up to human beings to galaxies and so forth, then we'll have to understand, in the case of me taking a hammer and hitting someone's hand, it's clearly off limits. I shouldn't be doing that because I have clear evidence under this framework that I'm causing pain. But you're right that if I smash a rock with a hammer, and that rock is just an interface symbol to a whole network of conscious agents that are doing something. So I am affecting a whole network of conscious agents. The question is, how much and in what way am I affecting it? And right now, I don't have an answer. Right. But that's going to be what the mathematics of the theory is going to have to tell me. And who knows? We may find that we have new limits in terms of what we should do, and like right and wrong, limits about right and wrong, and how we should interact with things that we didn't know about before. That will be very, very. I'm open to it. On the other hand, it may turn out that no, the way the interface works is, even though it looks to you like you're smashing a rock, what you're actually doing to the conscious agents, to them, is so trivial. It's roughly, maybe all you're really affecting is the really, really long-term behavior. And so it's like causing a migration of people, but it's a friendly migration. So they moved from Los Angeles to New York, but it wasn't a nasty, painful thing. It was a very pleasant, and they were looking at things as they went on their way. In other words, you may be causing changes that are very pleasant and over long periods of time, or you could be causing pain. And so we'll have to. I just don't know the answer yet. So that's you raise a very, very deep question, one that I've wondered about, but I haven't wondered too much, because I know that I have to get the right tools in place before we can actually try to answer it.
It's fascinating. It's a lot to think about.
Yeah. So
you said that you're working on a paper right now, which is about the conscious agent question.
Yes. So it's I'm doing it in collaboration with my colleagues, Robert Prentner and Manish Singh and Chetan Prakash. But what we have is, there's the question, when agents interact, can they combine to new agents? How does that happen? And how many ways can it happen? There could be more than one way that could happen. And also, can conscious experiences combine? Can I have somehow an agent with a red experience and an agent with a green experience? And could I actually somehow create an agent that is a brand new agent with a new experience that's yellow? Is that possible? And I was getting ready to give a talk for a conference where a bunch of quantum theorists got together with a bunch of philosophers and some cognitive neuroscientists like me. So it was a bunch of us talking about consciousness. This was, a month ago or so that we got together. And I was getting ready to present a talk on the combination problem. And I was just looking at our mathematics, and I was thinking about what I was going to say, and then all of a sudden I realized that what I was going to say was false. I looked at the math, and the math told me, no, what you're about to say to the group is false. That the conscious experiences are not combining. You're not getting any new experience. And I was stunned and a little scared, because I was, I already sent in my abstract, and I was so. But 2 minutes later, I realized that the math pointed me to another part where, in fact, the agents do actually fuse, and you do get a fusion of the conscious experiences. So it turns out, so this is interesting, where the math first told me that the way I was thinking about it was wrong, and then the math pointed me and said, but over here, you're right. So I thought it was true all the time, and it wasn't true all the time. It was true on a probability zero special case. It's only in a very, very special case that all these conscious agent interactions lead to a fusion where actually true new experiences are born. And so that's what I presented. And by the way, the video is online, so I can give you a link if you want to the video. So I gave that talk. It's hard to do it in half an hour. Yeah, it was a half-hour talk to go through all the math and so forth. But I do it. But it'll probably take a few hours to really understand what that math is saying. But still.
We'll put that in the description. It does really quickly remind me of the battle with artificial intelligence and understanding intelligence, because it seems like what you're saying is that, there's this parallel with intelligence where you're actually able not to just conceptualize what's happening, but to generate new concepts de novo out of the information that the system is screening. And humans and conscious entities in general seem to have this ability, which is perplexing to programmers, which is they can just take these concepts and come up with new concepts that link the other concepts together in ways that are completely unimaginable beforehand. And I think it's a really interesting corollary to your work in that domain.
Well, yeah, my thought on artificial intelligence is that the way it's typically thought of is the physicalist framework. So space-time and particles are fundamental. They're not living and not even conscious, but if we get the right complex organization, we can start to build up consciousness and intelligence and so forth. That whole framework is out, right? Space-time is doomed. That framework is just false. So, but if consciousness is fundamental, and we do have, space-time as an interface to this deep intelligent consciousness, and certain portals. So your body, as I see your body on the screen or in person, is a portal into your consciousness, right? And your body, when I look at your body closely, I see particles and so forth that in my space-time description. So there is some space-time description of particles and neurons and default mode networks and intentional networks and so forth that is a space-time correlate of some deeper intelligence. So the question is, so we do have portals into this deep conscious intelligence. And the question is, could we, once we understand our interface, develop new portals, brand new, qualitatively different kinds of portals into consciousness and this deeper intelligence? And I think the answer is yes, we can. We have the one technology for doing it right now, which is having babies. Every time
we're having less and less of those.
That's right. And every baby is a new portal. So if we can reverse engineer that portal, we might be able to create something in space and time that accesses this deeper intelligence as a portal to intelligence. And maybe that technology will look like circuits and software and artificial intelligence. But what we will have done is not start with unconscious ingredients and booted up intelligence. We will be consciousness interacting with consciousness through an interface and learning how to use that interface to open up new portals into the pre-existing consciousness. It will just look like silicon circuits and software, but that's just the interface representation. So you can see, I might end up saying that, yeah, artificial intelligence can be real and can beat humans, but it'll be in a different framework. It's not a physicalist framework, and it's not unconscious circuits and software that are somehow booting up a consciousness. We're opening up a new portal into the pre-existing intelligent consciousness.
It's really interesting how this leads inexorably to the development of a different kind of morality, where if you are opening portals into consciousness, and obviously we have a way of dealing with babies where we're like, well, they have a certain set of moral obligations that we have to them. But with something like AI, I think that people are still really struggling with what it means to...
Yeah, like I hope we don't regret opening that portal.
Usually people regret opening portals. I don't know.
There's probably a few babies out there that people regret opening that portal on.
I can think of a couple.
Stalin and friends like that.
I think that you're completely right that this will affect morality in fundamental ways, that once we understand these portals to consciousness and how our actions are affecting consciousness, that will change morality fundamentally. My portal, your body is a portal to your consciousness, and so there are certain things I should not do to that icon. I should not interact with your body in certain ways because that could cause harm. And as we begin to understand that portal relationship and the degree of portal and the degree to which our actions in our interface have consequences for consciousness, once we really understand that, then we may incur new moral obligations that we didn't have before, because now we know that when we maybe pollute something or something like that, that we're causing pain. I mean, right now it's just a metaphor, right? It might be an environmentalist metaphor, but maybe we'll find that in certain cases, and that is true. In other cases, it's not. Maybe lead poisoning is no big deal, but maybe something else is. So I don't know how it's going to come out, but I do agree with you that morality will be forever deepened and changed by this. Forever.
I love that. Mm-hmm. Well, I have so much to chew on right now. I feel like we should take leave, and hopefully we can, explore this with other thinkers too, and hopefully circle back and discuss what we've learned from those conversations down the road a bit. It's been really illuminating to talk to you.
Thank you very much. It's been a great pleasure, and thanks for inviting me.
All right. Take care, Dr. Hoffman. Thank you so much. Bye.
Bye.